If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The mansion of glass and concrete stood imposing in the heart of the Upper East Side, one of New York City's most exclusive neighborhoods. From the outside, it was pure sophistication, clean lines, enormous windows reflecting the sky, an impeccable garden where every leaf seemed to have been positioned by a designer. But anyone who looked closer, who paused for a few minutes before those high walls, would notice something strange. There was no life there, no sound of children playing, no laughter echoing through the garden, no music leaking from the windows. Just silence. A heavy, dense silence, the kind that suffocates. Inside that perfect house lived Isabella, a 10-year-old girl who carried in her eyes a sadness far too old for her age. Brown hair always tied back in a simple ponytail, fair skin that rarely saw the sun, a frame too frail for someone surrounded by luxury and expensive food. Isabella was a shadow within her own home. She spent her days sitting in the white armchair in the living room, staring out the window, or lying on the cold floor of her bedroom, drawing in a sketchbook no one ever asked to see. Her room was enormous, larger than many entire apartments in the outer boroughs of New York. It had a king-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets that were changed daily, a walk-in closet full of designer clothes she never asked to wear, shelves filled with children's books whose pages were still stuck together, expensive toys that remained in their boxes. Everything in there had been chosen by decorators, not by Isabella. Everything was impeccable, organized, lifeless. The walls were too white. The light wood floor reflected the cold light that streamed through the huge windows. There were no photographs hanging, no drawings taped to the walls, no sign that a child actually lived there. It was more like a spread from an architectural magazine than a 10-year-old girl's room. Isabella didn't go to school. She had no friends. She didn't talk to anyone. In fact, Isabella didn't speak. For 3 years, since that terrible day no one in the house dared to mention, the girl had become mute. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. The doctors had explained to her father, Edward Carter, that the trauma from the accident had caused irreversible damage. Isabella's vocal cords, according to the most expensive specialists in New York, had been affected by the emotional shock. It was rare, they said, but possible. The human body reacted in mysterious ways to profound tragedies. Edward had taken his daughter to dozens of appointments, tests, sessions with neurologists, psychiatrists, speech therapists. They all reached the same conclusion. Isabella would probably never speak again. And he, deep down, had accepted it as another punishment from fate, another bill he had to pay for what happened. Edward Carter was a 42-year-old man, owner of one of the country's largest real estate development firms. Tall, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, his gaze always serious, almost impenetrable. He wore Italian suits, Swiss watches, drove imported cars. He commanded meetings with a firm voice, closed multi-million-dollar deals, made decisions that affected thousands of people. But in front of his own daughter, Edward became a small man. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to look at her without feeling the weight of guilt crushing his chest. So he did what he did best. He worked. He spent 16, sometimes 18 hours a day at the office. He traveled for projects in other states. He attended business dinners, corporate events, anything to avoid coming home and facing the silence of that little girl. Caroline, Isabella's mother, had been gone for 3 years, killed in a car accident. Edward didn't like to think about that day, but the memories came uninvited, especially in the dead of night when the silence of the house became unbearable. Caroline was everything he was not: warm, generous, full of life. They had met in college, she studying medicine, he studying business. Edward had fallen in love with the way Caroline talked about changing the world, about using medicine to help those most in need. Back then, he thought it was beautiful. He admired her compassion, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. But the years changed Edward, or perhaps they just revealed who he had always been. As the development firm grew, as the money multiplied, as his power increased, Edward transformed. He became harder, more controlling, more obsessed with results. Caroline, on the other hand, remained true to her ideals. She graduated from medical school, specialized in pediatrics, but turned down offers from expensive private hospitals. She wanted to work with people who needed it. She started as a volunteer at a clinic in the South Bronx, a poor neighborhood where many children lacked access to basic medical care. Edward had always hated it. He thought it was dangerous, unnecessary. They had money, prestige. Why did she need to expose herself like that? She could make donations, fund projects, but she didn't need to go there herself, didn't need to get her hands dirty. The arguments about it started subtly, then became more frequent, harsher. Edward used arguments about safety, public health, the family's exposure. But what Caroline heard between the lines was control. He couldn't stand not having control over her. And on that morning, 3 years ago, the fight had reached a point of no return. Edward had discovered that Caroline was planning to expand the clinic, secure more funding, and was even considering leaving her part-time job at the private hospital where she worked to dedicate herself full-time to the volunteer project. He exploded. He said things he shouldn't have said. He threatened to use his contacts at City Hall to shut down the clinic for violations he would invent himself. He said that if she insisted, he would file for divorce and fight for custody of Isabella, using his money and his lawyers to ensure Caroline would never see her daughter again. Edward still remembered the look on Caroline's face when he threatened to use his contacts to close the clinic. He remembered her voice, trembling with anger and disappointment, saying that he would never change, that money and power had devoured the man she loved. Caroline took Isabella, who was 7 at the time, and left the house. Edward called again, continuing the argument over the phone as Caroline drove down the FDR drive. And then it happened. The crash, the impact. The silence after the call dropped. Edward never told anyone about those calls. At the hospital, while the doctors fought to save Caroline and she took her last breath, he was outside talking to his lawyer about how to control the narrative. Isabella was there. The little girl had heard everything. She had seen everything. And when the doctors finally came out of the room with that look that said everything without needing to say a word, Isabella simply stopped talking. Since then, she had never uttered a sound. Edward never knew that his daughter blamed him. He never knew that in the mind of that 7-year-old child, he was responsible for everything. To Isabella, her father had destroyed her mother with his words, with his control, with his sick need to be right. She kept that secret like an open wound, bleeding internally, invisible to everyone. The routine in the mansion was mechanical, cold, almost clinical. Isabella would wake up at 7 in the morning to the gentle touch of the on-duty nurse. There was always a nurse, competent, well-paid, professionals who followed strict schedules and medical protocols to the letter. They took Isabella's temperature, checked her blood pressure, and administered the medications prescribed by Dr. Letitia Foster, the psychiatrist who had been treating her since the accident. There were many medications, blue capsules that Isabella took upon waking, 2 of them, with a glass of water she had to drink to the last drop while the nurse watched. Small, bitter white pills at lunch that stuck in her throat. Yellowish drops that the nurse would place directly in her mouth 3 times a day, counting each drop with surgical precision. There was also a purple syrup for the night, which tasted like artificial cherry and made Isabella dizzy, causing her to fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep, more like passing out than restful slumber. Dr. Foster said they were necessary to stabilize her mood, control her anxiety, and help with her sleep. She had diagnosed Isabella with severe depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and generalized anxiety. She said the child was in deep psychological distress and that without the medication, she could have episodes of self-harm or worse. Edward paid a fortune for this treatment, something around $2,000 per session, and trusted the doctor blindly. She had an office in a luxurious building in Midtown Manhattan with a waiting room decorated by a famous architect and treated the children of New York's elite. She even had a 6-month waiting list, but of course, for those who paid enough, there was always an available slot. The problem was that the medication left Isabella in a constant state of lethargy. She spent her days in a kind of thick fog, as if she were walking underwater. She would stare into space for hours with no energy to play, to draw, to do anything. Her movements were slow, sluggish. Her eyes, already sad, became glazed without a spark. The nurses thought this was normal. They said it was part of the healing process, that she needed time, that the meds were working, and she would soon get better. But Isabella didn't feel like she was getting better. She felt like she was slowly disappearing, as if she were dissolving into the silence of that house, becoming transparent, invisible, non-existent. Edward rarely had lunch or dinner at home. When he was there, he ate alone in his study, locked away with his contracts and spreadsheets. Sometimes he would cross paths with Isabella in the hallway and avert his gaze, muttering a quick greeting before disappearing again. The girl tried to get his attention in other ways. There was an old bell in the garden, near the crabapple tree that Caroline had loved. Isabella would ring that bell every afternoon, hoping her father would look out the window, come down, and sit with her for a few minutes. But Edward never came down. Or he pretended not to hear. Or he really didn't hear, consumed by the noise of his own guilt. Isabella's loneliness was the kind that corrodes you from the inside. She wrote on a small whiteboard when she needed to communicate with the nurses. Short, direct words. Water, bathroom, no, yes. Never anything deeper. Never anything that revealed the storm raging inside her. At night, when everyone was asleep, Isabella would lie awake staring at her bedroom ceiling. She thought about her mother. She remembered her scent, her laugh, the way Caroline would hug her and say everything would be okay. She also remembered that morning, the argument, the car, the sound of the impact, the silence that followed. And then Isabella would cry, but without making a sound, because even her crying had become mute. The nurses changed every few months. None of them formed a real bond with Isabella. They were professional, efficient, but distant. They treated the girl like a patient, not a child. They followed protocols, wrote reports, passed information to Dr. Foster, and left at the end of their shift. The house would become empty again, with Isabella wandering through the enormous rooms like a ghost. Until, on a rainy Tuesday in August, everything began to change. The last nurse had quit abruptly, citing family problems. Edward was traveling to Chicago, closing an important deal, and had no time to find a replacement. It was his assistant, Marcia, who solved the problem at the last minute. She found a woman through a referral, someone who had worked as a caregiver before and was available immediately. Edward approved it over the phone without even asking for her name. He just wanted the problem solved. And that's how Teresa Miller entered Isabella's life. Teresa was 53, with graying hair tied in a simple bun, calloused hands from a lifetime of work, and brown eyes that held a mix of weariness and kindness. She was neither tall nor short, with a body that told the story of many years of manual labor, sleepless nights, and worries that etched themselves into her skin. She wore simple clothes, faded blue jeans, and a navy blue cotton shirt. Nothing that drew attention. But there was something about her, a presence, an energy that overflowed, despite her modest appearance. She didn't have a nursing degree. She had no certificates hanging on a wall. She hadn't gone to college. Teresa had only finished high school, dropping out to work and help her family. What Teresa had was experience. Life experience, the kind you don't learn in college, that doesn't come from textbooks or lectures. She had spent 15 years caring for her own son, Michael, who was born with a complex neurological condition that prevented him from speaking. The doctors had said Michael would never develop speech, would have motor difficulties, and would need special care for the rest of his life. Teresa, who at the time was a 23-year-old single mother, received that diagnosis alone in a public hospital and decided right then and there that she would do whatever it took. She worked as a cleaner during the day, a caregiver for the elderly at night, saved money for therapies, learned everything she could about her son's condition, and became an expert without ever setting foot in a university. Michael had passed away 5 years ago, at the age of 18. It hadn't been sudden, but a respiratory complication that his fragile body couldn't overcome. Teresa still missed him every day, still talked to him in her thoughts, still saw his face in every child she cared for. Since then, she had worked as a caregiver, always with children, always trying to give them what she had given her son: patience, love, and respect. She didn't see it as a job, but as a mission, a way to keep Michael alive through the care she offered to other children. When Teresa arrived at the mansion for the first time, she was struck by the size of the place, but also by its emptiness. It was a beautiful house, no doubt, but it felt like a mausoleum, cold, impersonal. Marcia, the assistant, greeted her, gave her quick instructions about medication schedules, what Isabella could and couldn't eat, and left. Teresa was left alone in the living room waiting to meet the girl. Isabella came down the stairs slowly, dragging her feet with that lost look the medication caused. She wore a simple white dress, slippers, her hair down and uncombed. She stopped on the last step and looked at Teresa with suspicion. Another nurse, she thought. Another person who will stay here for a few weeks, pump me full of drugs, and leave. But Teresa didn't behave like the others. She didn't pull out a clipboard to take notes. She didn't check Isabella's temperature. She didn't pull up a chair to sit far away, as if the girl were an experiment to be observed. Teresa simply knelt down, getting on Isabella's level, and smiled. A genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Hi, sweetie. I'm Teresa. I'm going to be staying here with you for a while. Is that okay?" Isabella didn't answer, of course. She just looked at the woman with those dark eyes that seemed too old for a child. Teresa didn't mind the silence. She stood up, looked around, and asked, "Have you had lunch?" Isabella shook her head no. The nurses used to leave a tray with food prepared by the cook who came in the morning, but Isabella rarely ate. She wasn't hungry, or rather she didn't feel anything. Teresa went to the kitchen, a huge kitchen full of expensive appliances that were rarely used, and opened the refrigerator. She found fresh ingredients but no real food, just pre-made salads, detox juices, things that looked more like medicine than meals. Teresa sighed and decided she was going to change that. "I'm going to make us some chicken and rice, okay? And some beans. Real food. I bet you've been missing that." Isabella watched her from the kitchen doorway, surprised. No one had cooked in that house for years. The cook who came in the morning just prepared salads and left everything packaged. But Teresa was there, washing rice, seasoning chicken, stirring pots, and the kitchen began to smell like it used to, back when Caroline was still alive and cooked on the weekends. Isabella felt a strange pang in her chest, something that hurt, but in a different way, a longing mixed with a glimmer of comfort. When the food was ready, Teresa set 2 plates on the kitchen table, not the huge formal dining table in the other room. She sat down and gestured for Isabella to join her. The girl hesitated but obeyed. Teresa started eating normally, without making a fuss, without forcing Isabella to eat too. She just talked, as if she were talking to a friend. "I had a son, you know? Michael. He was about your age when I started taking care of him in a different way. He didn't talk either, never could, but we understood each other. He'd look at me, and I knew what he wanted. Sometimes we don't need words to say what we feel. Silence can speak too, can't it?" Isabella looked at Teresa with a new intensity. Something about this woman was different. She didn't seem to pity her. She didn't seem to be there just for the money. She seemed genuinely interested, as if Isabella were a person, not a problem to be solved. Teresa continued, "You know what I learned from Michael? That everyone has their own time. Some people talk a lot and say nothing, and some people are silent and say everything. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I'm here to listen to you in whatever way you can express yourself." Isabella felt her eyes sting. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, so long since someone had treated her like she mattered. Without realizing it, she picked up her fork and started to eat. Slowly, but she ate. Teresa smiled to herself, without making a big deal of it, and continued talking about simple things. The rain outside, the beautiful garden, the crabapple tree that must bear delicious fruit. After lunch, Teresa asked if Isabella wanted to do anything. The girl picked up her whiteboard and wrote, "Draw." Teresa nodded and asked to see her drawings. Isabella led her to her room, took the sketchbook hidden under her bed and showed her. They were sad drawings, empty houses, lonely girls, enormous shadows. Teresa looked at each one carefully, without judging, without trying to interpret or lecture. "You're a very good artist, you know, but everything in here is so dark. How about we draw something colorful tomorrow? We could go outside in the garden and draw the flowers, the crabapple tree. What do you think?" Isabella wrote on the board. "No one lets me go in the garden." Teresa frowned. "Why not?" The girl wrote, "The nurses say it's dangerous." Teresa sighed. "Dangerous? A garden? That's nonsense. We'll go tomorrow, okay? You need some sun, some fresh air. You can't stay locked up in here forever." Isabella looked at Teresa with something that might have been hope. It had been so long since she had felt hope. In the following days, Teresa established a completely different routine from what Isabella was used to. They woke up together, had a real breakfast with warm bread, butter, and fresh juice. Teresa took Isabella to the garden, where they sat on the grass, drawing, having one-sided conversations. While Isabella wrote short answers on her whiteboard, Teresa cooked lunch every day, simple dishes full of flavor and care. And most importantly, Teresa never treated Isabella as if she were broken. But there was something that had been bothering Teresa since the first day: the medication. Isabella was taking an absurd amount of it. Teresa, who had spent years dealing with doctors because of Michael, knew how to recognize when something was wrong. Those doses weren't normal, especially the sedatives. Isabella was being kept in an almost vegetative state, and Teresa began to suspect that this wasn't just medical. Protocol. One night, after Isabella was asleep, Teresa took the medicine boxes and wrote down all the names. She searched online, on medical websites, and was shocked. This was over-medication. No child should be taking that combination of drugs. Teresa decided she needed to talk to Edward about it, but the man was never home. She left messages with his assistant, but Edward always had meetings, trips, unavoidable commitments. It was then that Teresa noticed something even more disturbing. One night around 2 in the morning, she woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen. As she passed Isabella's room, she heard a soft sound, a whisper. Teresa froze. She approached the door, which was slightly ajar, and peeked through the crack. Isabella was sitting up in bed, her back to the door, looking out the window. And she was talking. No, she was whispering a name. "Mom." Teresa's heart pounded. Isabella wasn't mute. She could speak, or at least she could make sounds, whisper. Teresa stood, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. If Isabella could speak, why was she pretending she couldn't? Why did she maintain that absolute silence in front of everyone? Teresa went back to the guest room where she slept, but she couldn't close her eyes again. Her mind was racing with questions. The next day she watched Isabella more closely, but the girl remained as silent as ever. She didn't make a single sound during the day. Teresa decided not to confront her yet. She needed to gain her complete trust before touching on that subject. She knew that if she pushed, Isabella would shut down even more. So Teresa continued with the routine she had established, but now she paid attention to every detail. She noticed when Isabella looked at her father's study with a mix of anger and sadness. She noticed how the girl would shrink whenever she heard Edward's car pull up. She noticed the silent hatred that shone in those dark eyes whenever her father appeared. 2 weeks after Teresa's arrival, Edward finally had dinner at home. He sat at the dining room table with Isabella on one side and Teresa on the other. The silence was heavy, dense, almost palpable. Edward picked at his food without appetite, staring at his plate as if studying an important document. Isabella did the same, pushing her food around with her fork, not really, eating. Teresa watched them both, this father and daughter who lived under the same roof but seemed to be in completely different worlds, separated by an invisible chasm of hurt and guilt. Edward was tired. He had just returned from a 3-day trip to Boston, closing a deal to build a new shopping mall. He was still wearing his dark grey worksuit, his tie loosened with deep circles under his eyes. He had a habit of working late, sleeping little, waking up early, and starting all over again. It was as if he were running from something, always busy to stop and think, to feel, to face what he had lost and what he continued to lose every day. Teresa served the dinner she had prepared, a hearty beef stew with cornbread, a meal that Caroline used to make on Isabella's birthdays. Teresa had found Caroline's recipe book in a kitchen drawer hidden in the back and decided to make that dish. She wanted to see Edward's and Isabella's reactions. And indeed, when Edward smelled it, he froze. His eyes filled with tears that he immediately tried to hide, coughing and reaching for his water glass. Isabella noticed, too. She looked at her plate with a mixture of longing and pain. "Mr. Carter, I needed to talk to you about Isabella's medication," Teresa began, her voice firm but respectful. Edward looked up, surprised. People rarely questioned anything in that house. "What about the medication?" "I think it's too much and too strong. The girl is listless all day. Do you think we could have the doctor re-evaluate it?" Edward frowned. "Dr. Foster is one of the best psychiatrists in New York. She knows what she's doing. Isabella needs those meds." "But have you ever tried asking Isabella if—" "She wants to take all of this," Teresa insisted, looking at the girl. Isabella looked up and met her father's gaze for the first time in weeks. Edward immediately looked away, as he always did. "Isabella doesn't talk," he answered curtly. "You know that." "She can write, you know that too. Have you ever tried talking to her?" "Look, Teresa, I appreciate your work here, but I didn't hire you to question medical decisions. Dr. Foster has been taking care of Isabella for 3 years and knows exactly what she needs." Teresa felt anger rise, but she controlled it. She knew confronting Edward like this would lead nowhere. He was entrenched in his own guilt and denial. She needed a different strategy. "All right, Mr. Carter, I just wanted to suggest that maybe it would be good to try other approaches too. Complementary therapies, you know. Maybe a different speech therapist, someone more human who works in a gentler way." Edward sighed, tired. "If you think it will help, fine. Talk to Marcia and have her schedule it. But don't change anything about the medication without talking to Dr. Foster, understood?" Teresa nodded, but inside she was already planning her next steps. She knew she had to find out the truth about Isabella. Why was the girl pretending to be mute? What had really happened that day, 3 years ago? And why did Edward run from his own daughter as if she were a ghost? That night, after Edward went up to his study and locked himself in as he always did, Teresa went to Isabella's room. She knocked softly on the door and went in. The girl was lying down, staring at the ceiling. Teresa sat on the edge of the bed and held Isabella's small, cold hand. "I know. You keep a lot inside you, sweetie, and I want you to know that I'm here. Not to judge you, not to force you to do anything, just to listen, in whatever way you want to talk. With words, without words, it doesn't matter. You're not alone anymore." Isabella looked at Teresa, and for the first time in 3 years a tear rolled down her cheek. Teresa hugged her, feeling the small body tremble against hers. And she stayed there, holding this little girl who carried a weight far too heavy for her shoulders, not yet knowing that the secret Isabella kept was much deeper and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. Outside, the rain fell hard on New York City, washing the streets, but failing to wash away the sorrows of that house. The days following that dinner brought subtle but significant changes to the house's dynamic. Teresa had planted a seed of doubt in Edward's mind, and although he wouldn't admit it out loud, he began to pay more attention to Isabella. Not much, not enough to completely break down the barriers he had built himself, but enough to notice details he had previously ignored. How his daughter was thinner than she should be, how her eyes seemed empty, devoid of light, how she moved through the house like a ghost, without making a sound, without leaving a trace. Teresa, for her part, was determined to understand what was really happening with Isabella. The discovery that night, when she heard the girl whisper her mother's name, wouldn't leave her mind. She knew Isabella was guarding a huge secret, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. But she also knew she had to proceed slowly, carefully, without scaring the child. Trust wasn't won with pressure, but with patience. It was Marcia, Edward's assistant, who scheduled the appointment with a new speech therapist. Teresa had insisted so much that Edward finally gave in, more for peace and quiet than because he truly believed it would make a difference. The chosen professional was Dr. Robert Allen, a man in his early 50s who had a completely different approach from the specialists Isabella had seen before. Robert worked in a small clinic in Greenwich Village, far from the ostentatious luxury of the midtown offices. His room was cozy, with colourful walls, plants in the corners, children's books scattered about and musical instruments hanging on the walls. Nothing white, nothing cold, nothing that resembled a hospital. Teresa took Isabella to the first appointment on a rainy September morning. The traffic was chaotic as always, and it took them almost 2 hours to get there. Isabella sat in the back seat looking out the window, watching the city go by. Towering skyscrapers, slums squeezed between luxury buildings, people rushing under umbrellas, street vendors at traffic lights. New York was like that, a city of violent contrasts where wealth and poverty shared the same block, sometimes the same street. When they arrived at the clinic, Isabella hesitated before getting out of the car. Teresa saw the fear in her eyes and held her hand. "Come on, sweetie. This doctor is different. You'll see." Isabella looked at Teresa, searching for confidence in those kind eyes, and finally got out. Dr. Allen greeted them personally in the waiting room. He was a short man with graying hair and round glasses that gave him the air of a distracted professor. He wore jeans and a plaid shirt, nothing formal. He smiled at Isabella and knelt to be at her level, exactly as Teresa had done on the first day. "Hi, Isabella, I'm Robert. You can just call me Robert, okay? No doctor here. We're just going to talk a little, get to know each other. No pressure, no rush. Is that okay with you?" Isabella looked at him suspiciously, but something about this man was different. He didn't have that air of superiority that the other doctors had. He didn't seem to be analyzing her like a clinical case. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her as a person. They went into the room and Robert didn't ask Isabella to sit in the patient's chair. Instead, he sat on the floor, cross-legged, and gestured for her to do the same. Teresa sat in an armchair in the corner, observing. The room was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen in a doctor's office. There was a colourful rug in the centre, cushions scattered around, a low bookshelf full of children's books and games. On the wall, drawings made by other children, each with a name written underneath. In the corner, a guitar leaned against the wall, a small keyboard, some percussion instruments. Everything there said, "This is a safe place where you can be yourself." Robert took out a box of crayons and paper. "Do you like to draw?" Isabella nodded shyly. "Good, I like to draw too. Let's draw together?" He took a piece of paper for himself and started drawing a simple house with a triangular roof and square windows like little kids do. Isabella watched for a moment, then took her own paper and started drawing too. They stayed like that for several minutes, just drawing in silence. Robert didn't ask invasive questions, didn't try to analyze what Isabella drew. He was just there, present. Every now and then he would comment on his own drawing. "I think I'll put a tree here. Do you like trees?" Isabella nodded. "Me too. There was a crabapple tree at my childhood home. My grandma made the best crabapple jelly in the world." Isabella stopped drawing for a second and looked at Robert. There was something familiar about that name, crabapple tree. Her house had one too. Her mother had loved that tree. Robert noticed her look and smiled gently, but didn't press. After drawing for a while, Robert picked up the guitar. "You know what I've discovered? Music is another way of talking. Sometimes we can say with a melody what we can't say with words." He started playing a soft tune without lyrics, just simple chords that created a peaceful atmosphere. Isabella closed her eyes, listening. It had been so long since she had heard real music. In the mansion, everything was silence or mechanical noises, the air conditioning, cars passing on the street, doors closing. Robert played for a few minutes, then stopped. "Do you want to try?" Isabella shook her head, scared. "That's okay. You don't have to play if you don't want to, but I can teach you some sounds. For example, you can imitate the sound of the guitar just with your mouth, like this." Robert made a hum sound, following the melody he had played. It was simple, without words, just sound. Isabella looked at him with curiosity. Robert continued, encouraging her with gestures. She tried to imitate the sound he was making, but stopped before making any sound, afraid. Teresa, from the corner of the room, noticed the girl's internal struggle. Isabella wanted to participate, but she was trapped in her own charade, in the silence she had chosen as a weapon. At the end of the session, Robert spoke briefly with Teresa away from Isabella. She has no physical damage to her vocal cords, at least none that I can perceive without invasive tests, and I'm not going to do that now. Her silence is emotional, psychological. I'm sure of it. But it will take time. I can't promise she'll talk tomorrow or in a month. Her time is her time. What I can do is create a safe environment where, if she wants to speak, she'll feel comfortable doing so. Teresa agreed that was exactly what she wanted to. Here, they scheduled weekly sessions, always at the same time, always in the same room. Routine was important for traumatized children, Robert explained. Predictability brought security. Meanwhile, Teresa continued to investigate the medications Isabella was taking. She had written down all the names and researched them online, but she wanted a professional opinion. She knew a pharmacist, Celia, who worked at a drugstore near where Teresa lived, uptown. She took the list of medications for her to analyze. Celia put on her reading glasses, looked at the list, and frowned. Wow, Teresa. This is a lot. A whole lot. And, for a child? She paused, rereading the names. Look, I'm not a doctor, okay, but I've been working with medicine for 30 years. This isn't right. This combination of benzodiazepines and antipsychotics, at the dosage written here, would leave any adult doped up. Imagine in a 10-year-old child. Teresa felt her stomach turn. So it's over-medication? Celia sighed. I can't say that for sure. Only a doctor can. But if you're asking for my personal opinion, yes. It seems like a lot. And look, there are some drugs here that shouldn't even be used together. The interaction between them can be dangerous. Teresa thanked her and left the pharmacy with a heavy heart. She needed to confront Dr. Foster, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed proof. Backup. She decided to talk to Robert again. The following week, during the session with Isabella, Teresa took a moment when the girl was distracted drawing and showed the list of medications to Robert. He read it, and his expression turned serious. Can I take a picture of this? Teresa nodded. Robert photographed the list with his phone and promised to consult a trusted psychiatrist colleague. 2 days later, Robert called Teresa. His voice was tense. Teresa, I need to talk to you in person. Can you come to the clinic tomorrow without Isabella? Teresa went, and what Robert told her left her in shock. He had shown the list to a child psychiatrist, Dr. Fernanda Costa, who had worked for years at Bellevue Hospital. Fernanda was horrified. She said the medication was completely inappropriate for a child, that some of the drugs weren't even approved for pediatric use, that the doses were far above the recommended levels. And what's more, Robert discovered that Dr. Foster had a questionable history. There were ethical complaints against her with the state medical board for irregular prescriptions, but nothing that had resulted in effective punishment. She had connections, expensive lawyers, and always managed to get away with it. Teresa, you need to get this girl away from that doctor, Robert said urgently, and you need to do it now. If she continues with this medication, Isabella could have permanent damage, neurological damage, chemical dependency. This is very serious. Teresa left the clinic trembling. How was she going to do this? Edward trusted Dr. Foster blindly. He would never believe Teresa, a simple caregiver with no academic background, over a renowned psychiatrist. She needed a plan. That night, Teresa couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking. And then she heard it again. Light footsteps in the hallway, the door to Isabella's room opening slowly. Teresa got up, went to her own door, and opened it just enough to see. Isabella was in the hallway, barefoot, in her nightgown, walking towards her father's study. But Edward wasn't home. He had traveled again. Isabella went into the study and turned on the light. Teresa waited a few seconds and followed her silently. When she reached the study door, she saw Isabella sitting in Edward's leather chair, facing the desk, and she was talking, not loudly but talking. Her voice was hoarse, weak, as if her vocal cords weren't used to working, but she was speaking. I hate you so much. You killed her, you killed my mum. Teresa felt tears well up. Isabella was talking to her absent father, saying everything she had kept inside for 3 years. Teresa stood paralyzed, not knowing whether to intervene or not. "Why don't you ever stop working? Why don't you look at me? I'm here. I'm alive. But you act like I left with her." Isabella's voice was laden with pain, anger, abandonment. "You don't love me. You never did. I wish I was never born." Teresa couldn't take it anymore. She entered the study and knelt beside Isabella. The girl was startled, her eyes wide, and she immediately fell silent again. Teresa held her hands. "Isabella, sweetie, I heard you talking." Isabella started to tremble. She tried to pull her hands away, but Teresa held on firmly without hurting her, just keeping her from running away. "You don't have to be afraid of me. I won't tell your father, not yet. But I need you to trust me. I need you to tell me what happened. Please." Isabella looked into Teresa's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: sincerity. There was no judgment there, no fear, no disappointment, just genuine love. And that's what broke the barrier. Isabella opened her mouth and, with a failing, hoarse voice that sounded rusty, said, "I'm not mute. I never was. I just pretended." The words came out with difficulty, breaking in the middle, hurting her throat. Years of not using her voice had taken their toll, but she was talking. She was telling the truth for the first time in 3 years. Teresa nodded, encouraging her to continue, holding Isabella's small, cold hands. "Why, sweetie? Why did you pretend?" "Because I wanted him to suffer." Isabella began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face, falling onto their clasped hands. "I wanted him to feel what I felt when she was gone. I wanted him to be speechless, just like I was left without my mom." Her voice was a painful whisper, each word costing an immense effort. "I wanted him to see me every day and remember what he did, what he caused." Teresa hugged Isabella, who collapsed in her arms. The girl cried like she hadn't cried in years, sobbing, shaking, letting all the pain pour out in waves. Her body shook with the force of her crying, years of pent-up tears finally finding release. Teresa just held her, rocked her, let her cry everything she needed to cry. And as she cried, Isabella told her story. The words came out in a rush, jumbled, mixed with sobs. She told of the argument she witnessed between her parents that Tuesday morning 3 years ago. It was early. She was having breakfast when she heard the shouting coming from the study. Her father saying Caroline was being irresponsible, selfish, that she was putting the family at risk with that volunteer work. Her mother responding that he had changed, that he was no longer the man she had married, that money had eaten his soul. Of the threats Edward made. Isabella repeated the exact words she had heard, seared into her memory like scars. "If you don't stop this nonsense with the clinic, I'll use all my contacts to shut that place down. I'll invent violations, I'll report you to the health department, I'll do whatever it takes. And if you think about leaving me, about filing for divorce, I'll fight for custody of Isabella. I'll prove you're a negligent mother who prefers to take care of strangers than her own daughter. You will never see her again." Of how Caroline, desperate and crying, took Isabella by the hand and left the house. The girl remembered her mother's hand trembling, her red eyes, her broken voice when she said, "Come on, honey, we're going for a drive. I need to breathe." How they got in the car, how her mother drove through the streets of New York, still early, the traffic already starting to get heavy, of how she heard the phone ring and ring. Her mother would look at the screen, see it was Edward, and let it ring. But he wouldn't stop. He called again and again and again, until Caroline, frantic, answered and put it on speakerphone without thinking. And Edward was on the other end, still yelling, saying that if she didn't come back right now, he would do everything he had threatened, that she was making a terrible mistake, that she would regret it. Isabella remembered being in the back seat, hearing everything, seeing her mother cry as she drove. She remembered the FDR drive, full of cars, the rain that had started to fall. Her mother trying to answer her father, trying to explain, trying to make him understand. And then, the light that was yellow and turned red, and Caroline, distracted, desperate, didn't see it in time. The impact, the sound of twisting metal, of shattering glass, of horns all around. The pain. the silence that followed. And after the accident, Isabella recounted, she was in the hospital, injured but conscious. She heard Edward talking to his lawyer. She heard him say they needed to control the narrative, that they couldn't let anyone know about the fight, about the threats, that he had an image to protect, a company to maintain. Isabella realized in that moment that her father cared more about his own reputation than about the wife who had just passed away. "So I decided," Isabella said, her voice hoarse and weak. "I decided he was going to pay, that I would make him suffer as much as I was suffering. At first I really couldn't talk, the shock was too great. But after a few months my voice came back, slowly, and when I realized I could speak again, I chose not to. I chose silence." Teresa held Isabella's face, making the girl look into her eyes. "But sweetie, do you understand that by hurting him, you're also hurting yourself? You're trapped in this silence. You're losing years of your life. Would your mother want that for you?" Isabella shook her head, crying even harder. I know she wouldn't. But I can't stop. Every time I think about talking to him, I remember that day. I remember him at the hospital, worried about lawyers, about the company, about money. Not about my mom. Not about me." Teresa hugged Isabella again and stayed there, holding that broken child, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had fallen on her shoulders. She knew everything now. She knew the secret, the pain, the silent revenge, and she had to decide what to do with this information. "Isabella, we're going to fix this, I promise. But you need to keep pretending for a little while. Longer, okay? Just until I figure out a way to really help you. Do you trust me?" Isabella nodded, wiping her tears. Teresa took her back to her room, put her in bed, and sat beside her until she fell asleep. And then Teresa went back to her own room, but she didn't sleep. She stayed up all night thinking, planning. In the following days, Teresa began to subtly reduce Isabella's medication doses. Not by much, not enough for the nurses or Dr. Foster to notice in the reports, but enough for Isabella to start emerging from that fog. She'd throw away a pill here, half a capsule there. Isabella noticed and said nothing, just thanked her with her eyes. And slowly the girl began to have more energy. She started drawing with more enthusiasm, eating better, taking an interest in the things around her. Teresa continued to take her to sessions with Robert, who noticed the improvement but didn't ask questions. He trusted Teresa. In the sessions, Robert began to discreetly work on Isabella's voice. He used exercises disguised as games, singing softly along with him, whispering answers to questions, imitating animal sounds. Isabella participated when she was alone, with him and Teresa always in secret. Her voice was weak. It hurt when she used it for too long. Years of not speaking had atrophied the muscles. But it was coming back. Edward remained distant, but Teresa noticed that he began to watch his daughter from afar. Sometimes she would catch him standing in the living room doorway, watching Isabella draw in the garden. He wouldn't approach, but he no longer averted his gaze so quickly. A change was happening in him too, slow but real. It was on a Thursday afternoon that things started to get dangerous. Teresa was in the kitchen preparing lunch when the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands and went to answer it. It was an elegant woman in high heels and a light pink suit, her flawless blonde hair in a French twist. She wore sunglasses too big for her face and carried a designer handbag. "Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Leticia Foster. I've come to make a routine visit to Isabella." Teresa's stomach tightened. The doctor had never come to the house before. She always saw patients at her office. Why was she here now? "Of course, doctor, please come in." Teresa kept her voice calm, but inside she was on high alert. Leticia entered, taking off her sunglasses and examining the house with a critical eye. "Where is the patient?" "She's in her room, resting. Would you like me to call her?" "No need, I'll go up. Where is her room?" Teresa showed her the way and accompanied the doctor. When they reached the room, Isabella was lying on the bed reading a book. She looked up and saw Dr. Foster, her expression immediately tensed. "Isabella, dear, how are you?" Leticia approached the bed but maintained a calculated distance. Her smile was cold, overly professional. I came to check on how you're responding to the treatment. The nurses have been sending me reports, but I wanted to see for myself. Isabella didn't answer, of course. She just looked at the doctor with those dark, impenetrable eyes. Letitia took a clipboard from her bag and started making notes. Teresa stood in the doorway, watching. "Have you been taking all your medication properly? At the right times?" Letitia asked, without taking her eyes off the clipboard. Isabella nodded. "Excellent, very good." Letitia finally looked at her. "And how are you feeling? Still having those nightmares?" Isabella hesitated, then nodded again. Letitia made more notes. "I'm going to increase the dose of the nighttime sedative. That should help." Teresa couldn't hold back. "Excuse me, doctor, but wouldn't it be better to try reducing the medication instead of increasing it? Isabella has been very listless." Letitia turned slowly to Teresa, and her gaze was pure ice. "I'm sorry, but who are you exactly?" "I'm Teresa, Isabella's new caregiver." "I see. And do you have a degree in medicine, in psychiatry?" "No, but I have experience with children and—" "Then I think it's best you leave the medical decisions to those who studied for it, don't you?" Letitia cut in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate your concern, but Isabella has been under my care for 3 years. I know exactly what she needs." Teresa wanted to argue, but she realized it would be pointless. Letitia was in a position of power and she was just the caregiver. Any direct confrontation would only make things worse. She needed another strategy. Letitia finished her visit, prescribed the new doses and left the house. But before she left, she turned to Teresa with a warning. "Look, take good care of our Isabella, and don't forget, the medication must be administered exactly as I've prescribed. Any alteration could be dangerous." It was a veiled threat. Teresa understood perfectly. That night, Teresa talked to Isabella about the visit. The girl was visibly shaken. "She hates me," Isabella whispered. "She's always hated me. She wants me to stay like this forever." Teresa frowned. "Why do you think that?" "Because she makes money from it. My dad pays her a lot. If I get better, she loses a client." Teresa realized Isabella was right. Letitia had a financial interest in keeping the girl sick, dependent, medicated. It was cruel, it was unethical, but unfortunately it wasn't uncommon. Teresa had heard stories like this before. She decided she needed to act fast, but she had to do it smartly. She talked to Robert, who suggested gathering concrete evidence. Isabella's blood tests showing medication levels, opinions from other psychiatrists, documentation on the effects of overmedication. With that in hand, they could confront Edward in a way that he would have no choice but to believe them. Teresa also started writing everything down in a notebook. The medication times, the prescribed doses, Isabella's reactions, the changes in behavior when she reduced the doses. She kept this notebook hidden at the bottom of her suitcase, along with the empty medicine boxes she was throwing away. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Teresa started getting strange looks from the cook, Marlene, a 60-year-old woman who had worked in the house since before Caroline passed. Marlene would arrive in the morning, prepare the day's meals, and leave at noon. She had always been quiet, professional, but Teresa noticed that she watched everything attentively. One day, when they were alone in the kitchen, Marlene approached Teresa and said softly, "You're doing the right thing." Teresa turned, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I know you're reducing the meds. I saw you throwing the capsules in the trash." Marlene paused. Mrs. Caroline didn't trust that doctor either. She wanted to switch, but Mr. Carter insisted, said Dr. Foster was the best. Teresa felt she had found an ally. "Did you know Mrs. Caroline well?" Marlene nodded, her eyes welling up. "I've worked here for 15 years. I saw Isabella being born. I watched that marriage fall apart little by little. Mr. Carter changed a lot after the company grew. He became cold, controlling. Mrs. Caroline tried to resist, but he just sucked the life out of her. That argument on the day of the accident wasn't the first. There were years of fights, of threats. Do you think Mr. Carter is to blame?" Marlene sighed deeply. Not directly, no, he didn't cause the accident, but he pushed her to it. Mrs. Caroline was desperate that day. I saw her leaving with Isabella. She was shaking, crying. And he stayed here, yelling on the phone. Marlene wiped her eyes. Isabella heard everything. She was in the car with her mom. She knows everything. Teresa nodded. I know, she told me. Marlene looked at Teresa with hope. You can save this girl. You have to get her out of here. Away from this doctor, away from these meds. And if possible, away from him too. But Teresa knew it wasn't that simple. Edward was Isabella's father. Legally, he had all the rights. And besides, Teresa still believed that father and daughter could reconnect, that it was possible to heal that relationship. They just needed time, truth, and courage. What Teresa didn't know was that time was running out, and that forces she couldn't even imagine were about to come into play. The next night, when Teresa was putting Isabella to bed, she found something strange under her door. A plain brown envelope with no return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was an old photo of Caroline leaving a commercial building in downtown Manhattan. On the back, handwritten in a shaky script, "She knew too much, and now you do too." A chill ran down Teresa's spine. Someone was watching. Someone knew she was investigating, and that someone was warning her that she was in dangerous territory. Teresa put the photo in her secret notebook and decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. She had to protect Isabella, and she had to find out who was behind that note before it was too late. Outside, the New York night pulsed with its millions of lives, its secrets, its stories. And inside that glass mansion, a silent war was just beginning. Teresa didn't sleep that night. She sat on the bed in the guest room, staring at the photo she had found under her door. Caroline, leaving a commercial building, her expression worried, looking from side to side, as if she were being followed. The photo was old, probably taken weeks before the accident. What was Caroline doing there? What building was that? And who had taken that picture? The questions swirled in Teresa's head. She knew she was meddling in something dangerous, something that went beyond Isabella's over-medication or the secrets of a wealthy family. There was something bigger happening, something someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. In the morning, as the sun began to stream through the window, Teresa made a decision. She had to find out what building that was in the photo, and for that, she needed help. She picked up her phone and called Robert. She needed to tell him everything, show him the photo, ask for guidance. Robert answered on the third ring, his voice still sleepy. "Hello? Teresa, is everything okay? It's 6 in the morning. Robert, I'm sorry to wake you so early, but it's urgent. I need to show you something. Can you meet me at the clinic later?" "Of course. How about 9? Robert was more awake now, sensing the urgency in her voice. "Perfect. I'll see you then." Teresa left Isabella sleeping, told Marlene she had to leave early, and took a cab to Greenwich Village. When she arrived at the clinic, Robert was already there with 2 coffees ready. They sat in his office and Teresa showed him the photo and the note. Robert studied the image carefully. "I know this building. It's in downtown Manhattan near City Hall Park. It's an old building, has a lot of law offices in it." He turned the photo over. "She knew too much?" "Knew what?" Teresa shook her head. "I don't know. But someone is warning me to stop investigating. Someone is watching me." Robert grew serious. "Teresa, maybe you should go to the police. This could be dangerous." "And say what? That I received an anonymous photo. They won't do anything." Teresa sighed. "I need to find out what's going on before I make any moves. Otherwise, I could put Isabella at risk." Robert thought for a moment. "I have a friend who's an investigative journalist, Andrew Sullivan. He works for an independent news site. He's good at digging things up. Do you want me to talk to him?" Teresa hesitated but nodded. "Yes, please." Robert called him right away. Andrew answered quickly and, after hearing a summary of the story, agreed to help. They arranged to meet that afternoon at the building from the photo. Teresa returned to the mansion, trying to act normal. Isabella was awake, having breakfast with Marlene. The girl looked at Teresa with concern. Even without speaking, her eyes asked, "Where were you? Is everything okay?" Teresa smiled and nodded, trying to convey calm, but inside she was tense. She knew the next few hours would be decisive. In the afternoon, Teresa told Marlene she needed to take Isabella to an appointment, and they left together. They took an Uber downtown. The traffic was hellish as usual, and it took them almost an hour to get there. The building from the photo was on a busy street, surrounded by small shops, street vendors selling everything imaginable, and people rushing from one place to another. Robert and Andrew were already waiting in front of the building. Andrew was a man in his mid-30s, thin, with a scruffy beard, messy hair, a backpack slung over his shoulder, and a camera hanging around his neck. He had the tired look of someone who works too hard for too little money, but his eyes were alert, intelligent. "So show me this photo," Andrew said. Teresa handed it to him. He studied it carefully. "This is the place. I'll see what I can find out. Give me a few minutes." Andrew went into the building, spoke to the doorman, showed some form of ID, and asked a few questions. He came back 15 minutes later with information. "This building has about 20 offices, mostly lawyers, but also some accountants, a few doctors' offices. I got a list from the doorman." He showed his phone with a photo of the directory. "Now we need to figure out which of these places Mrs. Carter visited." Teresa looked at the list. So many names, so many possibilities. How would they find out? It was Isabella who gave them the clue. She pointed to one of the names on the list, Davis and Associates Law Firm. Teresa frowned. "How do you know, sweetie?" Isabella took Teresa's phone and typed on the digital whiteboard app Robert had given her. "I saw this name on my mom's papers, in her room." Andrew and Robert exchanged glances. "Teresa, can you get into her mother's room and look for those papers?" Teresa nodded. "I can. Try tonight." "Great. Send me a picture of anything you find," Andrew said, handing her his card with his WhatsApp number. They returned to the mansion in the late afternoon. Edward was home, a rare occurrence. He was in his study, as usual, but at least he was home. Teresa prepared dinner, served Edward and Isabella, and waited for the night to come. Around 11 o'clock, when everyone was asleep, Teresa slipped into Caroline's room. It was a room no one had touched since the accident. Edward kept everything exactly as it was. The bed made, the clothes in the closet, the books on the nightstand, like a shrine, or like a wound he refused to let heal. Teresa turned on only a small lamp and began to search. She went through drawers, closets, shelves, and finally, at the back of a desk drawer, she found a folder. Inside were documents, lots of documents, contracts, spreadsheets, handwritten notes from Caroline, all meticulously organized. Teresa photographed everything with her phone and sent it to Andrew. The reply came 20 minutes later. "Wow, Teresa, this is gold. I'll analyze everything. I'll talk to you tomorrow." Teresa put everything back exactly as she had found it and returned to her room, her heart racing. She had a feeling she was about to uncover something huge. The next day, Andrew called early. "Teresa, you need to come to my office, now. Bring the girl too, and if possible, her father. This is too serious." Andrew's office was in a modest commercial building near Times Square. Teresa managed to convince Edward to go, saying it was about Isabella's health, that she had discovered important things about her treatment. Edward, reluctant but curious, agreed. When they arrived, Andrew greeted them in a small room, with desks piled high with papers, old computers and whiteboards covered in notes. There was another person there, a woman in her 40s with short black hair, large glasses, and a serious expression. Andrew introduced her. "This is Rachel Davis, a prosecutor from the DA's office. She's been following this investigation for some time." Edward tensed immediately. "What investigation? What are you talking about?" Andrew took a deep breath and began to explain. "Mr. Carter, your wife, Caroline, was investigating a fraud and corruption scheme involving your own company and several doctors in New York. She had discovered that Carter Development was overbilling for public works projects, using materials of inferior quality to what was contracted, and embezzling money. Furthermore, there was a network of doctors, including Dr. Letitia Foster, who were prescribing unnecessary medications in exchange for hefty kickbacks from the pharmaceutical industry. The silence in the room was absolute. Edward turned pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "That's a lie. My company is legitimate. I would never allow—" Andrew interrupted him, showing the documents Teresa had photographed. "It's all here, Mr. Carter. Caroline had been gathering evidence for months. Overbilled contracts, fake invoices, records of improper payments. She was about to report everything when the accident happened." Prosecutor Davis continued, her voice firm but compassionate. "And what's more, there are strong indications that the accident may not have been just an accident. Caroline was being followed in the weeks prior. There were veiled threats. The photo Ms. Miller received is part of a body of evidence we've been gathering for months. Caroline went to the law firm to formalize a complaint. She was preparing everything to expose the scheme." Edward sank heavily into a chair, his hands trembling, his face as white as a sheet. "I didn't know any of this." He looked at Andrew, at Rachel, desperate. "I swear I didn't know. I trusted my directors, my managers. I thought everything was being done ethically." Rachel looked at him with a mixture of severity and pity. "Mr. Carter, your CFO, Charles Brandon, and your project manager, Michael Frazier, are under investigation. They are the main ones responsible for the overbilling scheme, and Dr. Letitia Foster is being investigated for medical malpractice, deliberate over-medication, and illicit enrichment. She kept several patients, including your daughter, on unnecessary treatments to ensure a continuous profit." "And my daughter?" Edward looked at Isabella, who was sitting next to Teresa, absorbing everything in silence. "The medication she's taking? Was all of it unnecessary?" "Completely unnecessary," Robert answered, joining the conversation. "Isabella never had any physical damage to her vocal cords. The initial trauma was real, but she could have recovered naturally with proper therapy. Instead, Dr. Foster kept her sedated, doped up, to prolong the treatment indefinitely." Edward covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. "My God, what have I done? What did I let them do to my daughter, to my wife?" Isabella looked at her father. For the first time in 3 years, she saw Edward truly broken, truly repentant, truly human. And something inside her began to shift. The anger was still there, pulsing like an open wound, but now it was mixed with something else. Pity, perhaps, or the remote possibility of forgiveness. Teresa held Isabella's hand and whispered, "It's time, sweetie. It's time for you to talk to him. For real." Isabella looked at Teresa, frightened. Teresa nodded encouragingly, her eyes conveying strength and security. Edward lifted his head, confused, looking from one to the other. "Talk? But she can't talk. She's mute." Isabella took a deep breath. Her vocal cords ached, years of disuse taking their toll. But she opened her mouth and, in a weak, hoarse but unmistakably clear voice, said, "I could always talk, Dad." Edward froze. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open in shock. "What? How?" "I pretended," Isabella continued, each word costing an immense effort, but coming out with determination. "I pretended to be mute because I wanted to punish you, because I blamed you for Mom's death, because I thought you deserved to suffer as much as I was suffering." Tears began to stream down Edward's face, silent, plentiful. Isabella went on, her voice growing a little stronger with each sentence. "I heard everything that day, your argument, the threats you made. I was in the car with her when you called, screaming, saying you were going to destroy everything she loved. She was crying, desperate, shaking. And that's why she didn't see the light. That's why the accident happened. Because of you." Edward stood up, staggered, took a step towards Isabella, but stopped, not knowing what to do, as if he didn't have the right to get closer. "Isabella, I didn't know you were listening. I never imagined my words could cause so much harm." "But they did," Isabella said, her voice now firm, filled with years of repressed pain. "You killed her with your words, with your control, with your need to always be right, always in charge. And after she was gone, you abandoned me. You left me alone in this huge house, full of strangers, full of medicine I didn't need. You chose work, always work, instead of looking at me, hugging me, crying with me. Edward fell to his knees on the floor right there in front of everyone, sobbing like a child. Isabella, forgive me. Please forgive me. I destroyed everything. I destroyed your mother. I destroyed you. I destroyed our family. I'm a coward. I ran from you because I couldn't look into your eyes without seeing everything I did wrong, without seeing her, without feeling the guilt suffocating me. Isabella got off her chair. For a moment she stood still, looking at her father on his knees before her. Teresa held her breath. Andrew, Robert, and Rachel watched in absolute silence. And then Isabella took a step forward, and another, and she knelt in front of her father. And for the first time in 3 years, she hugged Edward. Edward held her as if he were holding on to life itself, sobbing, shaking, repeating, "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." Isabella was crying too, but now they were different tears. They weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of relief, of liberation, of a door opening after being locked for years. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Isabella whispered in her father's ear. "It hurts too much. But I want to try. I want to try because being angry is killing me, inside. And Mom wouldn't want that for me. She would want me to live." Edward pulled back a little, looking at Isabella through his tears. "I'm going to fix this. All of it. I'll fix the company. I'll cooperate with the investigations. I'll get justice for your mother. And I'm going to be the father you deserve. Even if it takes the rest of my life, I promise I will be." Isabella nodded, still crying, but now with a faint smile on her lips. A small, fragile, but real smile. Teresa, Robert, Andrew, and Prosecutor Davis gave them space for that moment, knowing they were witnessing something rare and precious, the chance for a new beginning after everything had fallen apart. In the weeks that followed, a lot changed. Edward immediately fired Charles Brandon and Michael Fraser, initiated rigorous internal audits, and cooperated fully with the prosecutor's investigation. He discovered the scheme was even larger than he had imagined, involving other companies and more doctors. He was shocked by his own blindness, by how he had let himself get so caught up in numbers and profits that he lost sight of what truly mattered. Dr. Letitia Foster was formally charged with medical malpractice, deliberate over-medication, corruption, and criminal conspiracy. She lost her medical license and would face a criminal trial. Other doctors involved in the scheme were also investigated and suspended. Isabella immediately stopped all her medications, but under proper medical supervision. The first few days were very difficult. Her body, accustomed to years of sedatives and anti-anxiety drugs, reacted with tremors, insomnia, intense anxiety, even mild hallucinations. Robert coordinated a team of ethical doctors who monitored her day and night during the most critical phase of her detox. Edward stayed by her side through the entire process. For the first time in years, he cancelled meetings, postponed trips, and put work on the back burner. He held Isabella's hand when she trembled, stayed up with her during sleepless nights, and talked with her about her fears and hopes. She also began intensive vocal therapy with Robert and other specialists. Isabella discovered that years of not using her voice had atrophied the muscles and caused stiffness in her vocal cords. Every session hurt, every exercise was a challenge, but she persisted, and slowly her voice returned. Stronger, clearer, more alive. Edward drastically reduced his work hours. He delegated responsibilities, hired a new team of directors, all carefully vetted. He established a new culture in the company based on transparency and ethics. He lost some contracts for refusing to participate in shady deals, but he gained something much more valuable: integrity. He had dinner with Isabella every single day without exception. He took her for walks on the weekends. They visited places Caroline had loved: Central Park, where Caroline used to run every morning; the Met, where she would spend hours admiring art; the clinic in the South Bronx, where she had volunteered. Edward met the people Caroline had helped, heard stories about her kindness, about how she changed lives. Slowly, father and daughter began to rebuild a bond that had seemed impossible months before. It wasn't easy. There were emotional setbacks, days when Isabella woke up angry at her father, remembering everything he had done all the lost years. Days when Edward sank into guilt, feeling he didn't deserve his daughter's forgiveness, that he should just disappear from her life. But they talked. They went to therapy together with a psychologist specializing in grief and family reconstruction. They cried together. They yelled at each other when they needed to. And slowly they healed together. It wasn't a complete cure, not a Hollywood happy ending, but it was real. It was honest. It was possible. Edward created the Caroline Carter Foundation, dedicated to providing free medical care to underprivileged children, exactly as Caroline had dreamed of doing on a large scale. He invested millions of his own money, recruited the best professionals, and built clinics in poor neighborhoods across New York. Isabella actively participated in the decisions, helping to choose projects, visiting the clinics, and meeting the children they served. Teresa, after 6 months at the mansion, decided it was time to leave. Isabella didn't need her anymore, she needed her father. And Edward was finally ready to be a real father, to be present, to love without fear. Teresa refused all of Edward's offers. He tried to give her an apartment, a car, a well-paying position at the foundation. She refused everything. She only asked for a photo of Isabella, smiling, a real smile, to keep alongside the photos of Michael. On the morning Teresa left, Isabella hugged her tightly and whispered, her voice now recovered, "Thank you for teaching me how to use my voice again, not just to talk, but to live. You saved my life." Teresa smiled, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "The voice was always in you, sweetie. You just needed the courage to use it, and you are the bravest girl I've ever known." Edward also thanked her, emotional, holding Teresa's calloused hands. "You saved my daughter. You saved my family. You saved me. How can I ever repay you for all of this?" Teresa shook her head, her smile gentle and tired. "Just take care of her. Be the father she deserves. Be present, be alive, be real. That's the only payment. I want—" And she left, carrying only a worn-out suitcase and a heart full of gratitude for having made a difference in that girl's life, for having helped break the silence of an entire house, for having witnessed the transformation of a broken family into one that was slowly learning to heal. The years passed. Isabella grew up strong, determined, and full of life. She went back to school, graduated high school with excellent grades, and went to college for medicine. She graduated with honors, specialized in child psychiatry, and dedicated herself to caring for children with emotional trauma, communication, difficulties, and painful histories. She treated each child as a person, never as a diagnosis. She never prescribed medication without real need. She used her own story to understand their pain, to show them that it was possible to heal, that it was possible to live again, that silence could be broken and a voice could return. Edward completely transformed the company. Carter Development became a model of ethics and transparency in the industry. It won awards for social responsibility, sustainability, and corporate governance. But Edward said the award that mattered most was his daughter's smile, being able to have dinner with her, hearing her voice every day. He never remarried. He said Caroline had been the love of his life and that, although he had failed her terribly, he would spend the rest of his days honoring her memory through concrete actions, through his love for the daughter they had raised together. The relationship between father and daughter was never perfect. The scars remained. Isabella still had nightmares sometimes, still woke up crying, remembering the accident. Edward still carried the guilt, still wondered if he truly deserved the forgiveness his daughter offered him little by little. But they learned to live with the imperfections, to turn them into strength instead of weakness. They had dinner together every week without fail. They talked about everything, about Caroline, about the painful past, about the future full of possibilities. Isabella introduced boyfriends to her father. Edward met his son-in-law, attended her wedding, and cried with emotion as he walked her down the aisle. And years later, he met his grandchildren, 2 beautiful, lively children. The first, a boy whom Isabella decided to name Michael in honor of Teresa's son. The second, a girl named Caroline, in honor of her mother. Edward was a present, loving grandfather, completely different from the absent father he had been. He played with his grandchildren, took them to the park, told them stories, and always he spoke of Grandma Caroline, about how kind, brave, and full of love she was. One Sunday afternoon, 20 years after that terrible day on the FDR Drive, Isabella took her own son, 5-year-old Michael, to visit Caroline's grave. Edward went with them. They brought fresh flowers, crab apples they had picked from the tree at the mansion, and a drawing the boy had made. They placed everything carefully on the clean, well-kept grave. They stood there in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Little Michael broke the silence with the typical innocence of children. "Grandpa, is Grandma Caroline in heaven?" Edward looked at his grandson, then at Isabella. She nodded encouragingly, her eyes shining with restrained tears. Edward knelt beside the boy, getting down to his level. "Yes, she is, Michael, and she's very proud of all of us." "Why, Grandpa?" the boy asked, tilting his little head. "Because we learned something very important that she always knew." Edward's voice faltered, but he continued. "That love is stronger than anger, that the truth, even when it hurts a lot, sets us free, and that it's never ever too late to start over, to change, to be better." Michael thought for a second, his little face serious. Then he smiled and hugged his grandfather tightly. "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, my boy, so much." Edward hugged him back, his heart tight but full of gratitude. Isabella watched the scene, her heart so full of emotions it could barely fit in her chest. Gratitude for having had the courage to use her voice that day in Andrew's office. Gratitude for having found Teresa, that simple woman who changed everything. Gratitude that her father had the courage to face his own mistakes and truly change. Gratitude for the life she was able to build from the ruins. Their story was not a fairy tale. It never would be. The losses were real, deep, impossible to erase. The pain had left permanent marks. The scars still ached on rainy days, on birthdays, on special dates. But it was a story of real, honest, possible redemption. Of a father who faced his terrible mistakes to change, who chose humility over pride, who learned that success is not measured in money but in love. Of a daughter who gave up revenge to live again, who transformed her pain into purpose, who chose to use her voice to help other silenced children. Of an ordinary caregiver who, with empathy and courage, broke the silence of an entire house and showed that love is stronger than any other force. And above all, it was living proof that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but choosing every day to build something better from it, transforming pain into purpose, silence into voice, hate into love, destruction into reconstruction. The bell on the crabapple tree chimed in the wind, a soft, melodic sound that cut through the silence of the cemetery. Isabella smiled through her tears. She knew that, from somewhere beyond this life, Caroline was watching, and she was proud, and she was, finally, at peace, just as they, too, were learning to be. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Isabella, Edward, and Teresa has touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of pain, silence, and redemption, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it Isabella's courage in revealing her secret, Edward's transformation, or Teresa's dedication? Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing that it's possible to start over even after the greatest tragedies. We'll see you in the next episode, with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on what truly matters in life.